Okay, good afternoon. I'm Jessica Berg. I, along with Michael Sharf here, are the Deans of the Law School. We'd like to welcome you to our noon lecture series. We have a very special guest today, Peter Eigen, who is the founder of Transparency International. He is actually a lawyer by training, although tells us it's been quite a while since he's gotten to use his law degree, so he feels right at home with all of you. Transparency International is an extraordinary organization, has chapters in more than 100 nations, and has become the leading non-governmental organization promoting transparency and accountability in development. Mr. Eigen is the 2016 recipient of the Inamori Ethics Prize, which he will be awarded this evening, but we are extremely lucky to have him join us here this afternoon for what will be a question and answer period. So for all of you that have questions to ask him, this is an excellent opportunity and experience to get a chance to interact. And I will now turn it over, and thank you so very much for joining us.
So, my name is Dalinjebo Shabalala. I'm visiting assistant professor here at Case in International Intellectual Property. And I've been fortunate to work in some of the same areas and some of the same organizations that Peter has. One of our shared organizations that we've worked with is the Center of International Environmental Law, which was my home and continues to be my home now that I'm on the board. Peter used to be on the board. We don't get to be on the board together anymore. But we are fortunate to have Peter here and thankful to the Inamori Center for enabling us to bring him here to the law school. Peter has asked me to try to make him look good. Yeah. Nobody has to do that. In all fairness, he is one of the most accomplished international activists, somebody who has, I think, made real the possibility of people who work both with and outside government to effect real change in policy and in outcomes. And really by piloting in the organization a methodology that really we hadn't seen before. The idea that research and transparency, and to some extent shame, can be powerful incentives for international governments and international organizations to make change. So it's my privilege to be moderator today of a Q&A session. So to that extent, it'll be driven largely by you. I will, of course, take moderator privilege to ask the first two questions, and then we'll open up the floor to you. Please wait until one of us comes to you with a microphone, and then you can ask your question, and then Peter will do his best to answer them in his usual inimitable way. So, everybody knows to some extent what you have done, right? But I don't think people know what you are doing now and the things that you consider to be important to work on now. And so I want to ask that first question. For you, what is the preeminent challenge and issue that you find it important to spend your time and resources working on at the point in your life that you are now?
Well, thank you very much. This is a question which invites me in self-indulgence, which was, of course, a pleasant activity. I feel what we learned in Transparency International was that we can strengthen global governance if we bring in civil society organizations as partners of governance. That's what we did when we started in about 20 years ago with Transparency International, when we faced a situation where most countries allowed foreign bribery of their citizens, with the exception of the United States and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, when in particular European countries were very hesitant to even discuss corruption. And when, therefore, the World Bank, under the instruction of its member countries, didn't dare to touch corruption as a general issue. At that time, we noticed that if we mobilize civil society in a professional way to interact with governments and with the private sector, that we can change things. And this experience is for me so important that I'm trying to apply this now in other parts of bad governance. In fact, I would say of failing global governance in many areas. And therefore, I am now outside Transparency International involved in a social enterprise, in a not-for-profit organization, which is called Humboldt Viadrina Governance Platform, to try to apply this magical triangle of interaction between civil society organizations, governments, and the international organizations, and the private sector in order to address poor governance in a effective way. And this is sort of, for me, a mantra which I find extremely important, in particular at a time when global governance is obviously failing, when obviously we cannot be happy that there are 1 billion people living below the absolute poverty line in the world. If we see that about 1 billion people don't have access to fair drinking water, about 2 billion people don't have access to sanitation, when millions of people are refugees all over the world, in particular in Europe right now. When we see that death and destruction is caused by unfairness, by a violation of human rights, violation of other basic values, one has to commit oneself to find a solution. And for me, this magical triangle, as I like to call it, is a wonderful answer. And therefore, I'm right now developing areas in which I feel this can help. For instance, in the fisheries sector, in the garment industries, in climate policies. So in all these areas, I try to apply what I learned at TI. I try to use a network which I have established there. And this is not only extremely interesting for me and exciting, but it's also a lot of fun, because we see that we get a lot of support. And the Inamori Prize here, for instance, is just a wonderful part of it.
Thank you. So now to a tougher question, I suppose.
Yeah.
So we seem to be living in an era of shamelessness. We see what we would have expected from the exposure of the Panama Papers to see rats scuttling to hide from the light, and yet we haven't seen the reaction that I think many people expected from the exposure that the Panama Papers provided. We see the structures in Russia and in China, the very kind of open sense in which people are moving money across borders, clearly engaging in behaviors that many would consider corrupt or self-dealing. One of the things that I think some people would point to would be the shift by the former president of the Commission, Barroso, from the position of the Commission to now working for one of the largest global oil companies with interest in Europe, and seeing that as this kind of deal-making, this kind of culture of shamelessness around the global cultural elites and the movement of privilege and money. Is there really now a role for the kind of transparency that drove your initial work? Do people really feel shame in quite the same way? Does it have the same power? Or are we really looking at something that contributes to the greater sense of apathy and learned helplessness and despair that a lot of people feel about current politics?
Well, I'm relatively optimistic. I see areas in which we have been very successful in overcoming this carelessness, this lawlessness, this shameful policy, for instance, in the countries which allowed their citizens, their companies to bribe outside their borders. In Germany, for instance, in the past, when a big company went out to Kenya or to South Africa or to Poland or to Russia or to China and managed to get a big contract and had to pay $10 million to various ministers, perhaps presidents, perhaps heads of parastatal agencies. They had absolutely no shame about it. They thought this is necessary. In fact, they defended this by saying these are different cultures. In fact, people in Indonesia, they like to be bribed. I mean, this is part of their value system. Who are we, the Germans, to impose our Judeo-Christian values on the markets where we want to do business? So this was sort of the hypocrisy which came with this position. And the same thing was true for the UK, same thing in France, same thing in Japan, in Canada, in most OECD countries. And this has changed. I mean, we managed to basically join these other actors of governance, which is the national government of Germany, for instance, which is very much at the service of its big companies. We got together with the companies themselves and their leaders, and we mobilized the media and civil society and academia to create a system where eventually everybody was convinced it would be in the interest, say, of German business to compete in a corruption-free global market, rather than competing through middlemen, through all kinds of tricks in who is the best briber and got the best contracts. And when we managed to do this, in fact, we had 3 meetings at the Aspen Institute in Berlin. There's a side institute of the Aspen Institute on one of the islands on the Wannsee. And we had 3 meetings during the years of 1994 to 97, in which we talked to these businessmen. In fact, the first meeting was chaired by Richard von Weizsäcker, who had been our president, and he wanted to help us with our anti-corruption agenda. And the first meeting, we got this message, which I just sort of gave you in a short version, where the corporate representatives thought that they were doing a wonderful job, and therefore we shouldn't criticize them for being such great elements of German success in the international community. In the second meeting, we already found that they had seen that based on our publicity, based on our workshops, based on our media presence and so on, they had seen that it might be corruption what they are doing in other countries. In fact, one of the big German companies at the time had been caught bribing some people in Asia and had been blacklisted, which of course the German press didn't report about, except when we pushed them into it. So in the second meeting, they said, yeah, what we are doing, we wouldn't do in Germany because it would be corruption. But in the global economy, there is no governance. Everybody is bribing. And therefore, everybody has to sort of mend for themselves and do as best as they can. And therefore, we are justified to pay huge commissions and so on to middlemen who then bribe the decision makers outside Germany. And in the third meeting, we said, we will help you to escape this trap into which you have committed yourself, because they said they cannot stop, because everybody else is doing it. So we said, we help you by creating islands of integrity. That's what we called it at the time, in which we, in concrete competitive situations, say in a big World Bank contract over several $1 billion somewhere in Africa, we talk to all the bidders in a competitive bidding process and make sure that each of them will stop bribing at the same time, because everybody was afraid that the others were bribing. And on that basis then, the big companies accepted that what we were doing made a lot of sense. They wrote an open letter to the Helmut Kohl governance, and Helmut Kohl instructed his Minister of Trade at an effort at the OECD in Paris to try to create a system where foreign bribery would be criminalized. So that's what happened at that time. And now, on the basis of this open letter of the business community to Germany, Germany participated in the convention. France and UK also participated in the convention. They would not have signed a contract without joining the Germans. also under pressure of national chapters in their countries of Transparency International. And eventually the OECD Convention Against Bribery was signed in 1997. And it entered into effect in May 1999, which meant that from that moment on, there was a legal obligation of the signatories of this convention, 35 countries, member countries of the OECD, but also some other exporting countries, to change their laws. Now that's what happened at the time. And right now, and of course, civil society not only had to help the actors of governance, the official actors, to sign, but they also had to make sure that it would be implemented. Because, say, in Japan, which has signed and ratified, practically nothing has changed. And therefore, Japanese companies still can bribe under Japanese law outside Japan. In Great Britain, they said our law of 1812 is already good enough to stop our British companies from bribing outside Britain. But the reality was quite different. I mean, some of you may know the Al-Yamama case, which, where the Serious Fraud Office of the British government investigated British Aerospace for an incredible corruption case of £100 million sterling a year for 10 years in Saudi Arabia, where a big contract over £44 billion sterling was at stake. And the British government intervened. The Attorney General stopped the Serious Fraud Office from investigating this case because they felt it was in the interest of Great Britain to keep on good terms with the Saudi royal family. So Britain, even though they had been one of the most enlightened leaders in getting the OECD Convention signed, 5 years later, they blatantly refused to live up to that obligation. In fact, civil society organizations were outraged, including the TI chapter in London, and they basically appealed against that decision, and the High Court in the UK also tried to stop this intervention by the Attorney General, but the government then appealed the High Court's decision. It's a very interesting decision, and maybe some of you have read that decision. It is absolutely strident in criticizing the Blair government at the time. And the House of Lords felt that it was in the interest of the British people not to investigate that case. Now, that was only a few years ago, but civil society pushed this very hard, and we have other stories like that in other member countries. As I said, in Japan, we are not yet very successful. But the point I'm trying to make is, if there is a vigilant and professional and strong civil society organization, or a number of organizations which are pursuing the cases against corruption, then there is a lot one can do. Now, you ask about the Panama Papers. You probably know that your former president, Mr. Mbeki, was the chair of a commission of the African Union against illicit financial flows out of Africa, where about $50 billion every year are estimated to flow out of Africa. It's the same amount which the World Bank lends to all countries in the world every year, $50 billion. And it's about the same amount which is the official development assistance to the whole of Africa. This just leaves Africa. And of course, the secrecy of arrangements like the one which were disclosed in the Panama Papers played a big role in this. But this was basically our gospel and our battle cry for a long time, but nobody cared. But now with the Panama Papers, suddenly the rich governments notice that they are also victimized by this. Now they suddenly feel this is our tax money which is disappearing. And now suddenly the G20, and we have seen that in China, is trying to focus now on helping to block the illegal outflows, to block secret accounts, to block transfer pricing within companies, which has been basically the vehicle for stealing money in Africa and in other parts of the world. So I'm an optimist. What has changed in Germany is quite clear. I mean, a German company in the past would have been praised and would have given a tax write-off, would have given subsidies under export financing if they got a big contract through corruption, openly. Now, 120 companies in Germany are in criminal proceedings. They are top managers who are responsible for foreign bribery. They are being prosecuted. They're going to jail, you know. Not only Siemens, which has had to pay about $2 billion in lawyers' fees and fines a couple of years ago, but many other very respected German companies are now prosecuted. So there has been a tremendous change. And of course, we have still a lot of corruption. But, and you read a lot about it, perhaps more than 10, 20 years ago, when the tolerance of society, when the tolerance of the media for corruption was still much higher. But there is now something happening. And one of the most important things in the international community is that foreign bribery is now a crime in most countries. And therefore, if, for instance, in South Africa, there are arms contracts and so on driven by German suppliers, and they are bribing your leadership in South Africa, then the prosecutors in South Africa can get help from the German prosecutors, and who make sure that the companies in Germany are being investigated. So it's a long answer to a short question, but I think I want to convey to you the fact that corruption is something which one can control. Not completely. I mean, it would be terrible if there was no more corruption at all. But at least one can reduce it to a degree which is acceptable to society.
Thank you, Peter. Now we'll open up to the floor. Here first.
I'd be curious to know how you define corruption, or if you've given any thought to how you might define it and measure it. And in that context, I thought I would ask what you think of a common situation where an extremely wealthy donor makes a massive gift to a university, and the relevant leaders of that institution heap praise on that individual who may, in fact, be responsible for some very unwholesome activities. And does that cross the line, in your opinion, into corruption, or is that just something we should accept?
Well, I mean, the first question on definition is something which we have treated very lightly at Transparency International. I mean, we have, as you know, 110 national chapters in their own societies. They are in charge of diagnosing the problems. They are in charge of evaluating the possibility of changing things and so on. And therefore, what we do as a movement with our secretariat in Berlin, we have a very broad definition, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But we are very keen that this sort of trust element, the breach of trust, is part of our definition. So we don't call corruption money laundering or embezzlement or fraud or sort of drug trafficking and things like this. We have to focus on this element of corruption. It has to be fleshed out by our national chapters, and they are to some extent free to find a definition which is different. You know, in some parts of the world, you have tradition of gifts, of loyalty to extended families and things like that, which in some countries one would call corruption, in others you don't. So in that sense, we are rather decentralized. I mean, we are not like the World Bank, which tells everybody what to think, or like the Vatican. So we basically allow the civil society organizations in the various countries which want to participate in our battle to define their own problems. You ask how you can measure it. I mean, I personally was very reluctant to even ask that question. But many years ago, there was a young intern, somebody called Johann Graf Lambsdorff. He's now sort of a pretty famous professor in Germany, in Bavaria. And he was writing his doctor's thesis, and he said, I want to measure corruption. I said, what? Go ahead, you don't cost anything. At the time, we didn't have to pay interns. But don't talk about it. In particular, don't tell anybody that we are supporting that. And so he came back after a couple of weeks and said he had 54 countries, and he had ranked them by degree of corruptibility in the countries. And he had basically asked survey companies, which very often have some free questions if they have commercial clients. They have 10 questions for that which the client pays, but the client has only 8 questions. So they sometimes are putting in sort of pro bono questions for civil society organizations. And he found about 12 of these survey companies to ask simply the question, how much do you feel is a country affected by corruption of its leadership? And he put together these answers. He calculated the average, and that became the corruption perception index, which we issue every year. Now, when he came up with this, I said, fine, I don't need this, and don't tell anybody. And he said, okay, but I have already spoken to a journalist of Der Spiegel, but I told him he cannot publish it. And on the Tuesday thereafter, that's when Der Spiegel appears in Germany, there was this list of Transparency International index on corruption, and I was angry and furious. But I suddenly got a call from the Wall Street Journal from New York. And I said, Mr. Eigen, I hear that you can measure corruption. And can we come and interview you and so on? And suddenly I felt that we are growing up, that we're getting some attention worldwide. And I told my Graf Lambsdorff, I told him, he has done a wonderful job, and thanks, and I hope next year you have a few more. So on this basis now, we have developed a number of analytical tools which are very effective. They have weaknesses. I had tremendous discussions with leaders of governments all over the world who were complaining that they were not doing well enough in our index. In particular, Mahathir was very angry that they were not doing very well. He called us publicly Western hypocrites who don't understand Asian values and so on. And I wrote him a letter. I said, send us your anti-corruption experts, your statisticians, and we try to explain to them what we are doing. And they came to Berlin. So they stayed with us. At the time, we were still very small. We had perhaps 6 people or so in the whole secretariat. And they went back to Mahathir and said, this is first-class work these guys are doing. And he apologized to us in Parliament and basically said, still, your index is unfair because it looks only at the hand which takes the money and doesn't look at the hand which gives. And we then found money from the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago to also do a bribe payers index. But for that, we had to pay. And we listed about 25 countries in accordance with the propensity of their companies to bribe actively in the international marketplace. And this was a great crisis because until then, we were always tremendously supported by the US, by corporate America, General Electric, a couple of other big companies who suffered from the corruption of their competitors, from other countries. And therefore they thought we will come out of this index smelling like roses. Smelling, they did, but very badly, because they came out behind France, for instance, behind Germany, in the bribe payers index. And I must say, to the credit of the MacArthur Foundation, they didn't try to stop us from publishing this. And therefore, every 2-3 years, we have a bribe payers index. So this is how you can measure, if you want to measure. I personally don't like to measure that much. You had, I think, one last question, which was also particularly interesting. What was it again?
About, as an example of kinds of what I would call corruption of institutions where wealthy donors basically purchase praise.
Yeah, right. Well, when I came first to the United States to work at an American university, I was surprised how much money you are trying to collect from business. This is now also a problem in Germany. The public funding of universities in Germany is still very important, since in most universities you don't pay tuition. But the contributions of companies are growing right now. And in fact, my wife, who's with me here to receive the prize, she was a president of a university, and she is extremely active in this area. So you should perhaps talk to her. This is a big problem, and I, for a long time, thought that this is a development in the United States where, instead of paying taxes, rich people create foundations which have no political mandate, have no legitimacy really to decide about many issues in arts and public interest and so on. But then I myself received a fantastic contribution from the Ford Foundation at one point to work in Africa. And since this time, I'm convinced, you see, I'm also corruptible. So I now feel that one has to find a way to publicize this, one has to find a way to ring-fence basically the universities to protect their academic freedom and to make sure that the universities don't become sort of the handmaidens of business. But this is extremely difficult. And I know that, in particular here in Cleveland, there are fantastic donors. And perhaps I should ask you what your experience is with their interference with your work, with the direction of your work, with the studies you are allowed to do, and so on. I have a similar problem with the civil society organizations, which I'm praising. We have a budget, Transparency International, of about $40 million. And we get money from donor agencies, we get money from foundations, American foundations, German foundations. We take money from companies. So many NGOs here in the United States don't take money from governments at all because they feel this undermines their credibility. In Germany, it's nearly the other way around. They say you don't take money from companies because they spoil your reputation. I say you take money from everybody, and as much as possible, from as many people as possible. and this way you stay independent. But it's not easy, particularly when the big donors come in with huge money. And we have that also at Transparency International, where some fantastic donors come in with millions of dollars. And then we have to be very careful whom we want to allow in. Now we have rejected money when we knew that the money came from illicit sources. We have in particular rejected money when we knew that it was coupled with expectation that we basically whitewash the donors. So this is probably an art, and I have a feeling that American universities, in particular the great ones, like this one here, that they have learned how to deal with this.
Thank you. We have a question from there, and then another one from here after that.
It would seem that the media would be very important to the work that you do, that the media, would be able to kind of make or break the actions that you do, in the sense that they would be able to leave either a positive or negative impression on the public. So I was just wondering what your group does with respect to the media, and I would assume in some places the media is controlled, or there's monetary influences directed at the media as well. And so I was wondering what your group does to kind of mobilize or affect positive media stories about your work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The media are our strongest allies, but they can be also our strongest detractors. And of course, we have at our secretariat in Berlin, where we have now about 150 staff members, we have a rather large external relations department which cultivates the media, which has a very interesting website, transparency.org, and therefore we talk very actively with the media. I mean, I personally, I'm just coming right now from 2 interviews at the radio stations here in Cleveland. Last week, somebody called me In Berlin, I had a 1-hour radio discussion with a very, very good journalist with good questions. So yes, the media are important, but the problem is, of course, first of all, that the media themselves are very often corrupt. They are very often under the influence of certain big powers. You know, if you think of Berlusconi and his power over television in Italy, or other people of that kind of stature, and then I don't know. One has to try to help the media to become honest and transparent themselves, and this is what we are trying to do through training, through workshops, through distribution of material, and so on. In some countries in Africa, where we have national chapters, the media very often are incompetent. I mean, they are not necessarily biased, but they are totally incompetent. You know, I remember sort of press conferences in Nigeria, where there were about 15 journalists sitting around the table, and I talked to them for an hour. And at the end, they came to me and wanted to be paid to write something. And then I said, well, then you write something and you ask your editor to pay you. And they didn't write anything, you know. So it was pretty shameful. And of course, very often, the media also like to be quite unfair and one-sided. For instance, our index, we always say this is just a perception index. It is an index where we have certain weaknesses, which has to do with differences of answers which you get for a particular country. And you have to report this, but most of the journalists in the world only publish the naked index, you know. And so Argentina then says to Chile, you know, we are better than you are, and so on. And we raise a lot of problems everywhere in the world. So you're absolutely right. The media is a tremendous asset for us, and without that, people wouldn't take us very seriously. But even in Germany, for instance, I mentioned earlier this blacklisting of a German company somewhere in Asia, and I gave 2 interviews, and one newspaper, to their credit, they published it. Another one, they wrote it out, they sent it to me for authorization. I spent hours on it to make sure that it's effective. And when I looked at the next issue, it was not in there. So I called them, I said, what happened to our interview? And they said, well, the CEO of the company who was affected offered us to give us an interview himself. And you can imagine that this is much more interesting than your interview. And so I then said, where is that interview of the CEO? And they said, well, the last moment he couldn't do it. But you found in the same magazine, you found tremendous advertisements financed by that particular company. So this is in Germany, you know, where you have relatively free press, you know. Can you imagine how it is in Turkey, where when a journalist says that Erdogan and his family and so on are corrupt, you know, they are very often they are killed, they are harassed, they are brought into real trouble. So yes, the media is a huge subject, and I think we were quite lucky in many ways finding the right interaction with them.
Oh, okay, I couldn't help but notice on the media recently that there was this thing with where one presidential candidate is accused of running a pay-to-play operation, and another presidential candidate boldly steps up and says that he contributed a lot of money to people's presidential campaigns, and that he never had any problems with them granting him building contracts. Mm-hmm. So in light of that, do you think that this bribery and corruption, which occurs here in our own midst, is is any less than the bribery and corruption of other countries?
No, I don't think so. And I think the whole question of campaign financing, political party financing, is a huge issue in many countries. And I think it's worst in the United States. I think what we have observed in the past, how much the democratic process is undermined by political party financing and the influence which comes with this, is a disaster. I mean, we write every year a global corruption report, and a couple of years ago we had one on political party financing, and basically we compared the systems of political party and campaign financing in various countries. And at that time, we were still rather content with how it was in the United States. But since you have this Supreme Court decision to allow companies to finance political campaigns, I think the process has tremendously degenerated in the U.S. And I hope that one can find a way at some point to revert to a system which is more transparent, which is more open, where people have to declare where they get their money from, where certain donations are not allowed. I mean, we in Germany, we have a system of combined campaign financing. Political parties are financed, which make it into the parliament. We have a 5% cutoff in our federal government. In state governments and state parliaments, it's different from country from state to state. But every party which is represented in the Bundestag, they get state funding because they are fulfilling a certain public role. You know. And but then they can collect money from individuals, they can collect money from institutions, and it is very, very clearly prescribed how you deal with cash contributions, when you have to publicize contributions, how you can sort of split contributions in order to remain below the threshold of certain disciplines and so on. So in Germany, I think the system is quite good right now. It's not ideal, but we feel the way this is happening in the United States, and I don't know which presidential candidates you are talking about. I know nothing about American politics, but yeah, I know. Yeah. So I feel you should, in particular, the lawyers and the law professors here among you, they should try to think of a system where one can reintroduce a more transparency, more openness in the political process.
Right here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you advocate zero tolerance to corruption, or do you think there's circumstances where it's okay to be corrupt? Like, for example, if an entrepreneur in the developing world faces extortion, and only by paying a fee to a government agency will he keep his company active.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's appropriate in any circumstances to be corrupt, or to go with zero tolerance?
Well, I think one should treat this under the principles which deal with what we call in Germany Notwehr. You know, in other words, the honesty and non-corruption is not an absolute value. If you can save lives of 20 people in order to pay a bribe to somebody who is threatening them or something like that, then of course I would never hesitate this. I mean, if I could pay a guard in a concentration camp in order to get my family out and so on, I would always do that immediately. So it's a weighing. I don't know how you call that in English in criminal law. If you are
necessity or justification.
Justification, yeah. Isn't there a special word? In Germany we have two terms. I mean, one is Nothilfe, yeah. The other one is Notwehr. And Notwehr is clearly allowed if somebody threatens your family and you can save them, then you are allowed to do it, even though you perhaps have to violate or kill or something like that the other person. So it's a balancing act. But I would be very careful not to say, for instance, in this country we have a wonderful project, and we can build a dam, which would help millions of people in a hydropower project, $500 million. And there is a stupid bureaucrat who doesn't allow us to go ahead with the import licenses or something like that. Then to say it is justified to bribe that person, because that's exactly what leads to the systemic corruption in many parts of the world, because there you then build a real incentive for these bureaucrats, for these ministers, for these decision makers, for these presidents to extort you. And while I'm very much aware of some theories that in a situation like that, where a very bureaucratic, centrally controlled economy can be helped by bribing a few people and then building fantastic infrastructure or something like that for the people. This argument has been used by the Germans when they were bribing right and left, and by the Brits, the French. And I'm very happy that Jimmy Carter thought that American companies should not do that and introduce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Of course, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has something which we don't like at Transparency International. It has a waiver for facilitation payments. I mean, that was introduced under the pressure of corporate America, who basically said you are allowed to pay a little bit if you can facilitate a decision, even if that decision is quite legal. So you don't want to really bribe somebody to do something illegal. So if you have perishable goods on your ship, you come into a port, it's Saturday, and the port director says, well, give me $1,000, and I get you some people who will take care of your tomatoes and so on. And then you are allowed to give him this. But we at Transparency International, we don't condone this. We think this is just the foot in the door of corruption. So, but this is something where we do not try to be too fundamentalist. In particular, for instance, the World Economic Forum has issued a guideline for its member countries, which is called PACI. It's an abbreviation. I don't really know what it stands for, but this permits a facilitation payment which is very similar to the waiver which exists in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. So obviously he's trying to accommodate his American members and their general counsels when he tries to fight corruption. So, but these are the types of things which we leave very much to our national chapters to deal with. And we have an accreditation system in NTI, which makes sure that they don't go overboard and don't allow things which are contrary to the overall standards which Transparency International, through its membership meetings, decides.
If you have 5 minutes, we'll take 2 more questions. One from here, and then one from here.
Okay, I'd like to look at the other side of the coin for a moment. We've been looking at what the perspective is, looking outside at companies. I was a senior controller at a very famous German insurance company located in Germany, and then at a major Swiss bank. So I kind of know how the sausage is made. And it's pretty scary that what the public doesn't see. And the problem in Central Europe is that the whistleblower laws are not existent to very weak and almost impossible to apply. And I was wondering what you and groups like TI can do to help offer people like me a chance to share our information.
And let's get one more question in so that you can...
Thanks. And yeah, so going back to where you started, a lot of these problems you were discussing, hunger, poverty, water, sanitation, come down to problems of sometimes capacity in the local government. And that kind of ties into this other thread going through, which is like these tax systems. We had the Panama Papers and things like that. And here in America, at least, we have pretty decent freedom of information laws, but our tax records are largely blocked out of that. And I know in Europe, it's even harder to get access to administrative records from revenue agencies. And so can you talk a little bit about how those types of laws what can be done in that area to kind of facilitate access for the public, for the press, to keep an eye on what's going on and monitor corruption from that angle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, these two questions help me to illustrate one particular principle which we pursue at Transparency International. We look at fighting corruption in a rather holistic way. So we don't only look at criminal sanctions or so, or at sanctions more generally. We look at all the elements of an integrity system which a society has to protect itself against corruption. And whistleblower protection and freedom of information legislation are both elements which we list in like a cookbook against corruption. You know. We have an integrity source book in which we list all these elements which have to be in order, more or less, in order to have a good protection for society. Now, in whistleblowers, we have, of course, quite a number of ideas, and our national chapters very often ask for support. We here in the United States, there are a number of whistleblower organizations which protect whistleblowers, and the experiences which we have in various countries, we try to make them available in those chapters which feel that this is important in their country. Now, the U.S. system is relatively strong in terms of whistleblower protection. On the other hand, I mean, if you look at at Snowden sitting in Moscow, or at other people who have disclosed secrets, the American government, the American Secret Service, and so on, is extremely sensitive if their secrets come out. So we ourselves had a huge problem at one point, because one of our staff members, whom we didn't properly introduce in his job, he tried to complain that we are mismanaging money from USAID. We had a system of paying travel expenses in a lump sum way in the beginning for the staff members who go out, but when they come back, they have to account for it and have to bring evidence and so on, and then they either get what is missing or they have to repay what we didn't pay them enough. Now, on that basis, a Chinese member we have at Transparency International, he didn't understand that, and he only saw that we gave very often more money than was actually needed for the trip, and therefore they acted as whistleblowers vis-à-vis USAID, which was one of our donors. Now, USAID asked us, what are you doing? We explained it to them as a 5-minute telephone call, and the thing was settled. But the person who had told us this sued the USAID for violating the whistleblower laws. And so we had a huge problem with USAID because of this stupid misunderstanding. You know. So whistleblower protection is a difficult thing, in particular when you get into trouble with the really powerful people in the global economy. And some of our members, some of our staff members in various chapters have been harassed, have been killed. You know, and we had a case in Rwanda where a staff member was investigating a police corruption, and he was just killed by these policemen, you know, on the street. But I have to say, to the credit of Kagame, he is prosecuting this quite differently in Russia, you know, where you have similar cases and the government doesn't prosecute. So freedom of information legislation is, of course, a fantastic thing. And in our corruption perception index, there is a very clear correlation between the strengths of freedom of information traditions and practices in the Scandinavian countries, for instance, and the degree of corruption in these countries. So the Scandinavians are always up there because there it is possible to get access to tax records and so on. Now, I'm not sure in Germany we have problems of getting effective freedom of information legislation on the books. You know, we have 16 states, they all have different approaches. Our federal government has a lot of exceptions for sort of proprietary information or personal personal information about privacy or defense and security secrets which they want to maintain. And therefore, we are continuously battling with our authorities in Germany. But I have the feeling that what is coming out through the Panama Papers now and in some other similar situations will lead to a fact where at least these structures of these anonymous companies where the beneficial owners are not known and so on will belong to the past. And the British have already introduced in this summit against corruption last March or so that all companies in Great Britain have to list their companies. So the question of anonymity for saving taxes and so on will be settled in the UK. And of course, most of the tax havens which were disclosed in the Panama Papers were under British sovereignty, on the Virgin Islands. So in many ways, a lot will happen in this area. And of course, what we can do at Transparency International, we will do. But if I may make, since this is sort of the last answer I can give, if I may make a little appeal to all of you. I mean, when I look at you, you would be fantastic allies to have in our work. And I would simply appeal to you, follow a bit what we do, help us to deal with our issues. We have a lot of room. For instance, we have an American chapter, which has its headquarters in Washington, D.C., which needs more membership. It's not a real civil society organization for the time being. It's a technical group which has been very effective. But we need more students. We need more wisdom from established professionals in order to do this work. And I hope that I've convinced some of you that it would be good to include you in our work. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our other lectures. Neil Kachal is going to be coming, and the Art of Law conference will be on September 16th. There are sandwiches. Please take them. Students especially, we know how hungry you are, right? And we look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you.
So, that was wonderful. Thank you. You made me look good. And you made me feel good.